Boris Johnson announced a new plan for living with COVID-19, with all public restrictions expected to be scrapped as the government praises its vaccine rollout. Certain measures, such as surveillance of trends in public health and increased testing, will be retained to allow the government to respond to new variants. Number 10's statement acknowledges the detriment that successive lockdown measures have had on mental health and education, but reiterated the necessity of those restrictions for the sake of saving lives during the pandemic. Well, is the Prime Minister right to end the measures now and have the restrictions proven to be a success or a failure? Paul, I mean, it strikes me that this is now going to be one of the great battles because everyone says we must learn the lessons from the pandemic. But of course, what you see as the lessons from the pandemic depends on your position on the political spectrum, your position on the libertarian spectrum, perhaps. What do you think, first of all, about the ending of the restrictions? And what do you think about the battle for the lessons to be learned?
I think the ending of the restrictions is correct. I mean, when we didn't apply the restrictions at Christmas, we had all forecasts of doom that it was going to result in thousands of deaths. When the restrictions were lifted last summer, last July, the same people made the same forecasts, and on both occasions they turned out to be wrong, which kind of makes you question whether the lockdowns that we did undertake earlier on were indeed necessary. And there needs to be balance in the debate. For example, a couple of weeks ago, Johns Hopkins University published a study, a detailed study, that said that lockdown had really been ineffective in terms of reducing COVID-related deaths. It was something like 0.2%, but had come at enormous social and economic costs. So I think that the people who called it wrong last time are probably calling it wrong again this time. We do need to get back to normal. We need to be treated like grown-ups, and we need to learn to live with it, absolutely.
And there's a new book out by Professor Woolhouse, who's a member of the SAGE committee. And I see this as an early attempt to decide what lessons we have to learn. So Professor Woolhouse, for example, says that he was calling for urgency very early on in the pandemic and that he felt that closing our borders earlier would have been a good idea. But on the whole, he seems to be entirely against lockdown. And the reason for being against lockdown is that it is based on the theory that you can eliminate COVID, and he believes that you cannot. So these are interesting and I think nuanced conclusions in his new book. Arlene, how do you think the battle over what the lessons to be learned will play out?
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it, that we haven't heard much about the public inquiry recently. There was a flurry of activity around that a number of months ago about whether each of the devolved administrations should have their own public inquiry or whether we just have the main UK public inquiry, and no doubt that will come to the fore again. But to take Paul's point about differing restrictions across the UK, I mean, Scotland was quite, they put in quite a lot of restrictions, many more than in England. And it appears, from what I've been reading, that the death toll in Scotland is actually slightly higher than in England. So we will have to look at all of these things with hindsight. But I remember very well being told that the whole reason that we needed to lock down was to delay the virus from coming in, to give the NHS time to prepare for dealing with the virus. You remember it was always the sombrero, and you had to try and squash the sombrero, and when we were looking at curves in the modelling. You know, we'll have to challenge all of those assumptions that were given to us at the time. And again, to look at the modelling and the basis of the modelling. But I think it is right that the Prime Minister does continue to monitor, because it's through monitoring that you can prepare a plan for, God forbid, if this ever happened again, if another pandemic came. And I think we will have to look not only at the reaction when the pandemic came, but what plans have been put in place to deal with pandemics before it actually arrived. Because we know there were some plans, but those plans weren't stuck to. We did vary off into lockdowns and things like that. So The public inquiry will be very important. We will have to reflect on decisions that were taken and why those decisions were taken at that time, and whether the right decisions were made. And I think it'll be a very interesting voyage of discovery for all of us, including those of us who were involved in decision making at that time.
Right at the beginning, there was a sort of cat let out of the bag by the government that they were going for herd immunity. And that cat was then firmly stuffed back in the bag because they didn't want to admit that that was a policy. It now appears almost 2 years later that actually herd immunity is the policy, and indeed that it's quite a successful policy. It seems that 97% of our population has antibodies through the vaccination campaign and, of course, from the people who have been affected. But, Paul, it's quite interesting because this debate goes on and on. China, as we've seen in the Olympics, offers a completely different model of how to do with this. They're still on the policy of eliminating COVID. The Olympic Games have demonstrated they've been played without the public being present. They are inside an enclosed bubble or area. I cannot imagine how China is going to get out of this policy. But I think it's rapidly being proved that it is the wrong policy. And the United Kingdom, I think, comes out looking pretty good.
I think zero COVID is simply implausible. I think that the last 2 years have shown us that any policy designed to achieve that just isn't going to work. I mean, I've said from the beginning that for a very small percentage of people, this is a serious virus. There's no question about that. But for the vast majority of the population, it does not pose a serious threat. Indeed, millions of people have had it without even knowing that they've had it because they haven't demonstrated any symptoms. So I think from the beginning we should have taken a much more targeted approach, which is to say we will devote all of the resources necessary to protecting those who are genuinely vulnerable, all the resources of the state and civil society geared towards those people. But for the rest of the country, we allow people, so far as possible, to go about their normal business. I suspect now that that's probably in the future the kind of policy that we're going to introduce. So I think that much of the policy of lockdown in the last 2 years will have proved to be unnecessary, and I think that's the real tragedy.
It certainly sounds as though the three of us here are pleased that the restrictions are being removed in England, at least.